Let me tell you something people don't say enough. Silence is not weakness. It's wisdom dressed in discipline. We live in a world that's addicted to noise. Scrolling, shouting, showing off, constantly trying to prove something to someone. But here's the truth that changed my life. The loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. The quiet one. That's the one you watch. When you're silent, you're not passive. You're preparing. You're listening. You're learning. How? And while everyone else is busy making noise, you're making progress. There was a time in my life when I thought I had to speak up to be seen. How? But I learned real power doesn't announce itself. It shows up. It performs. It produces results without asking for applause. And when you stop explaining yourself to people who don't even understand themselves, you take your power back. Be silent, and you'll hear what others miss. See the moves others are too distracted to notice. Find the answers buried under the chaos. Because silence, that's where clarity is born. How? That's where peace starts to grow. That's where self-mastery begins. You know what we're not taught early enough in life? How to sit with ourselves? Quietly. Not distract, not defend, not react. Just sit and listen, not to the world, not to others, but to our own soul. Because here's the truth. The world has confused noise for strength. We think if someone's loud, if they're dominating the conversation, if they're quick to clap back, they must be confident, they must be in control. But most times, that's just insecurity in disguise. Noise is often a mask worn by people who haven't made peace with their silence yet. See, real strength, it's quiet. Not because it lacks something to say, but because it's already heard what it needs to hear. Silence teaches you to carry yourself without the constant need to prove anything. It trains you to respond with discipline instead of emotion. And that's the kind of strength that's unshakable. That's the kind that makes people lean in without you ever raising your voice. When you're silent, how? It's not because you're scared. It's because you're secure. You're not rushing to fill the air with noise just to feel important. You're grounded enough to know that stillness isn't a void. It's a choice. It's control. And that control. How? That's what separates people who lead their lives from those who react to them. Now, let me say this. Silence doesn't mean absence. How? It doesn't mean letting people walk over you. It's not avoidance. Silence is not weakness. It's wisdom under restraint. It's knowing you could speak, but choosing not to because the moment doesn't deserve your energy. There's a moment in every conversation, every conflict, every storm where silence becomes a form of self-respect. It's the moment when you realize that peace is worth more than being right. How? And you don't have to raise your voice to raise your value. Because when your silence is intentional, it starts to do the talking for you. People start noticing it. They start adjusting to it. Your presence becomes louder than any argument. And in that space, in that quiet, strength is born. But it doesn't stop there. How? Silence doesn't just build strength. It sharpens something deeper. It sharpens awareness. And awareness, that's where the real transformation begins. Most people don't realize how distracted they are until they get quiet. And it's scary at first, because when the noise dies down, all the thoughts come rushing in. How? All the stuff you've been running from. But that's the point. That's where the work happens. Silence doesn't just make you strong. It makes you alert. You start to notice things others don't. The tone behind the words, the pattern behind the chaos. You catch the red flags that used to slip by. How? You sense when something's off because now you're tuned in, not to the outside world, but to the inside one. In silence, your awareness becomes your compass. It shows you what to trust, what to walk toward, and what to walk away from. That's why so many people stay busy. They don't want that clarity, because clarity comes with decisions, and decisions come with responsibility. But when you're aware, you stop drifting through life reacting to everything. How? You start choosing. You become intentional with your time, your space, your energy. You stop entering conversations to win and start entering them to understand. How? You stop saying yes just to please people and start saying no to protect your peace. You begin hearing what people aren't saying, and that tells you more than their words ever could. That's the gift of silence. It tunes your focus. You don't waste your energy chasing things that don't feed you. You don't fall for distractions dressed as opportunities. You don't confuse urgency with importance because you've learned to pause, to observe, to sit with it for a moment before acting. And in that pause, that's where the power lies. Think about it. Most of your regrets, most of your stress came from reacting too fast, from speaking without thinking, from getting pulled into someone else's storm instead of protecting your calm. But now you're learning to pause. You're learning to hold back, not because you're afraid, but because you're aware of what you're protecting. You're not just protecting your silence. You're protecting your clarity, your energy, your strength. And let me tell you something else. Silence is how you study people, not judge. Study. How? When you're not so busy filling the room with your own thoughts, you start to hear what's really going on. You learn who respects your boundaries without you shouting them. You learn who listens when you don't talk over them. You learn who stays when you no longer try to impress them. Silence brings the truth to the surface. And when you're aware, you stop settling for the surface version of things. You want the real, the raw, the honest, not just in others, but in yourself. How? So when you sit quietly with your thoughts, you're not being lazy. You're recharging. You're aligning. You're reconnecting with that inner compass that's been drowned out by the world's noise. That's not wasted time. That's preparation. Because silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means something is building in you, around you, through you. And when the moment comes to speak, to act, to lead, you're not guessing, you're not reacting, you're not hoping. You're moving with awareness and rooted in strength. Not because you shouted your way to power, but because you were silent enough to hear where it truly lives inside you, waiting to be heard, not by the world, but by you first. Silence earns respect. Silence is strategy. The tone remains direct, thoughtful, and introspective, designed to engage, educate, how? And shift mindset without using any headers or abrupt closings. Respect is something a lot of people chase, and almost always in the wrong way. They try to earn it by being louder, by constantly defending themselves, by proving, explaining, justifying every move, every word, every belief. How? But the more you explain, the more you lose authority. The more you try to be understood by everyone, the less you're respected by anyone. Because respect isn't demanded through words, it's commanded through presence and silence. That's one of the strongest presences you can carry. When someone walks into a room and doesn't speak unless it adds value, you notice them. When someone stays calm in chaos while others argue, you listen. When someone chooses silence over drama, you respect their control, even if you don't agree with it. That's the power of restraint. It earns you respect without ever asking for it. People confuse silence with passivity. They assume if you're not speaking, you're weak. If you're not reacting, how? You're afraid. But silence isn't submission. It's self-possession. It's you saying, I don't need to participate in every conversation to be confident in who I am. And confidence like that is rare, because anyone can talk. Anyone can argue. How? But it takes strength to hold your tongue when you know it would be easy to clap back. It takes maturity to stay composed when your ego is being tested. It takes wisdom to realize you don't have to attend every battle you're invited to. People start respecting you when you stop needing their approval, when you walk in alignment with your values instead of in reaction to their opinions, when your silence isn't empty, it's intentional. How? And people can feel that difference. They see that you're not silent because you're lost. How? You're silent because you found a deeper kind of power, one that doesn't depend on being heard all the time, one that stands even when challenged, one that listens more than it speaks and still makes more impact than any volume could. Because silence reveals what words often hide: your values, your self-respect, your awareness. You stop trying to prove your intelligence with long explanations. You let your decisions speak instead. You stop trying to win people's favor with constant talking. You let your consistency do the talking for you. How? And when people see that you don't need to constantly assert yourself to feel worthy, they start seeing you differently. They start respecting you, not because you forced them to, but because they saw something in you they couldn't shake. Something real. Something grounded. That's what silence builds, not surface level approval, but earned, lasting respect. But let's go deeper, because silence doesn't just earn respect. It also plays a far more powerful role that people rarely talk about. Silence is strategy. It's not just a reaction. It's a calculated decision. See, most people rush to speak. They rush to respond, to defend, to argue. And in doing so, they reveal everything: their emotions, their insecurities, their game plan. And once you do that, you've lost your leverage. but the silent person, the one who doesn't reveal their hand so quickly. That person holds the power. Because silence gives you something few people have anymore, an advantage. It gives you time to observe, to listen, to analyze. It buys you space between what happens to you and how you respond. That space, that's where your control lies. You start picking up on cues you would have missed if you were too busy trying to prove a point. You start understanding people, not just their words, but their intentions. You begin to notice patterns in behavior, in timing, in emotion, and all of that. That's strategic insight. You don't react to bait anymore. You don't let urgency pressure you into bad decisions. You let people talk. And while they do, you listen for what they're really saying and what they're not. When you master silence, you stop getting played and start learning how to play the game with wisdom. You stop being predictable. You become unreadable. How? And in a world where everyone's quick to show their next move, unpredictability's power, you start making decisions based on perspective, not pressure. How? You're not moved by momentary emotion because you've trained yourself to pause, to breathe, to wait. And that waiting, that's where your strategy gets sharp. How? Because you're no longer reacting to what's loudest. You're focused on what's truest, and truth doesn't always come fast. Sometimes it shows up after the noise settles, when you've given it room to rise. That's why silence is a strategic tool, not just in conflict, but in leadership, in negotiation, in relationships, in everyday life. It creates margin. It builds credibility. It gives you options. And that's what smart people want, options. Not impulsive reactions, but thoughtful, deliberate responses that move them forward with intention. Wow. You ever notice the most effective leaders aren't the ones talking nonstop? They're the ones who speak last. How? The ones who let everyone else say what they need to say and then deliver one calm, clear sentence that shifts the entire room. That's not luck. That's discipline. That's strategy. That's someone who's practiced silence long enough to know the value of timing, of tone, of saying the right thing. Not first, but best. And when you live that way, your silence isn't just quiet, it's loaded. It carries weight. People start wondering what you're thinking. They lean in. How? They try harder to understand you because you're not giving everything away. You're not filling every space with your voice. You're letting the space do the work. And in that space, you hold your power. You don't need to post your moves before you make them. You don't need to over-explain your decisions to people who wouldn't understand them anyway. You don't need to clap back at every opinion just to feel seen. You know who you are. You know what you're building. And you're not in a rush to prove it. That's the power of a silent strategy. It's not passive. How? It's intentional. It's not insecure. It's deeply rooted. It's not weakness. How? It's the wisdom of someone who's finally realized sometimes the strongest move is saying nothing and letting everything unfold around the stillness you built. How? Growth doesn't always come in action. Sometimes it comes in stillness, in those moments where you're not achieving, not performing, not posting, just reflecting. The world has taught you that growth looks like hustle, like doing more, like grinding every second. But real growth, the kind that transforms you, that often happens in silence. You sit still and everything you've been ignoring starts to surface. The truth about what you want, the habits that aren't serving you, the conversations you've been avoiding, the pain you've buried under distraction. And it's uncomfortable because silence doesn't numb, it reveals. That's why most people stay busy. Not because they're productive, but because they're avoiding themselves. Because when you get quiet, you start to hear the honest version of you, not the curated one, not the one built for applause, how the one underneath all of that. And that version of you, that's where growth begins. Not in performance, but in presence. How? You start asking questions you've never had time to ask. Why am I doing this? Who am I becoming? What am I pretending not to notice? Those questions don't come when you're always surrounded by noise. They only show up when the world gets quiet and you finally have no one to distract you from yourself. Silence holds up the mirror. It shows you the patterns. How? The cycles, the repeated mistakes. And when you stop blaming other people for your pain long enough to really look at yourself, you gain something rare, ownership. Because growth isn't just about gaining new things. It's about shedding the old. The habits that comfort but don't serve. The stories you've believed for so long, they've started sounding like truth. the people you keep entertaining just to avoid being alone. How silence makes you confront all of it. And in that confrontation, there's a decision. Do I keep living on autopilot, or do I start becoming who I'm really called to be? Most won't ask that question. But those who do, they start evolving slowly, quietly, but deeply. How? They begin making choices based on purpose, not pressure. They stop explaining their process to people who aren't doing the work themselves. They stop trying to heal around noise and start going inward. Because growth isn't always loud. It's not a highlight reel. Sometimes it looks like going to bed early, saying no more often, walking away without closure, admitting I was wrong and I need to change. And those shifts, they happen in silence, in the spaces no one sees, in the small, consistent acts of self-respect. That's where the roots take hold. You stop needing recognition to feel worthy. How? You stop needing noise to feel alive. You stop chasing things that only feed your ego and start building habits that feed your soul. That's what silence does. It creates the space for that kind of growth. Because if you're always reacting, you can't reflect. If you're always talking, you can't hear the lesson. If you're always moving, you can't see where you're going. But when you pause, when you stop trying to keep up with everyone else, you finally start catching up with yourself. And that growth, that still subtle internal shift, that's power. Because silence doesn't just invite growth. How? It attracts power. There's a certain type of presence you carry when you don't need to be loud. A certain strength that follows someone who doesn't force it. People sense it. They lean in when you speak, not because you're loud, but because you're thoughtful. Because your words aren't many, but they matter. You stop talking just to fill the air. You speak when it counts. And because you don't try to be heard all the time, people actually start listening. That's power. Power isn't about controlling people. It's about controlling yourself. And silence teaches that. It teaches you how to master your emotions, how to stay rooted when everything around you is shaking, how to remain calm in the middle of chaos, not because you're detached, but because you've done the inner work. That calm, that's the kind of power you can't fake, and it draws people in. Not because you're flashy, how, but because you're grounded. Not because you chase influence, but because you embody integrity. There's a reason quiet confidence feels so magnetic. It's rare. Most people perform confidence. But when you've built it in silence, through healing, through setbacks, through boundaries, you don't have to prove it. How? You carry it. You walk into rooms differently. You respond to challenges differently. You stop needing to control the outcome because you've already mastered your own role in it. And people feel that. They respect it. They trust it. That kind of power isn't granted. It's earned in silence. Through the discipline of listening more than you speak. Through the restraint of walking away when provoked. Through the patience of waiting when it would be easier to force. Because silence doesn't mean you don't care. How? It means you care enough not to waste energy on things that don't deserve it. You stop arguing with people who misunderstand you on purpose. How? You stop begging for attention. You stop proving your worth to those who are committed to overlooking it. You don't shrink. You just stop explaining. That's power. How? You realize you don't need to defend every boundary. You just enforce it. You don't need to win every argument. You just walk in truth. You don't need to broadcast every move. You just make progress. And when people start asking how you did it, how you built that mindset, that peace, that focus, you won't have a dramatic story. You'll just have a process, one that was forged in silence, because silence gave you the room to become powerful on your own terms. And that kind of power, that's the kind no one can take away. It's not built on status. How? It's not built on validation. It's built on the ability to pause, to think, to grow, to act when it matters most. So while the world is chasing noise, attention, how, and urgency, you move differently, not rush, not reactive, not loud, but rooted, clear, ready. Because you've learned silence wasn't an empty space. It was the training ground for everything powerful you're becoming. Be silent, you will get everything in life. Not by noise, but by knowing when to say nothing and when to become everything.